At 30 degrees below zero, the world becomes hostile to human life in ways most of us have never experienced. Water thrown from a cup doesn't fall to the ground, it freezes in the air, scattering across the snow as ice crystals that catch the light like tiny prisms. The moisture in your breath doesn't rise and dissipate. It crystallizes instantly, falling back as fine ice dust that settles on your beard, your eyebrows, the wool of your collar, until your face becomes a mask of white. Metal becomes dangerous. Touch a rifle barrel with a bare hand, and your skin adheres to it immediately, as if glued. Pull away too quickly, and the skin tears from your fingers, leaving raw flesh exposed to air that burns like fire. Frostbite can begin on exposed skin in under 10 minutes. The first sign is numbness, a loss of sensation that feels almost like relief from the cold's assault. That numbness is the beginning of the end. The tissues are dying, starved of blood, as your body desperately redirects warmth to protect the core. Ears, nose, cheeks, fingers, the extremities sacrifice themselves to keep the heart beating, the brain functioning, the vital organs warm for another hour. This is what 30 below zero means. Not a number on a thermometer, a world where the air itself has become your enemy. And yet, in the Rocky Mountain territories of the 1860s, there were men who traveled through this frozen world carrying no tent. They brought no overhead shelter of any kind. They slept on the frozen ground, deliberately exposed to the stars above, and rose at dawn, ready to travel another 20 miles through the snow. These weren't desperate men pushed beyond reason by circumstances. This wasn't emergency survival, the last resort of trappers caught far from shelter. This was a chosen method of travel, preferred by the most experienced frontiersmen, the scouts, the guides, the mountain men, over carrying conventional shelter. They chose this because they knew something we have forgotten. Something about fire, about the earth beneath them, about the human body's relationship with cold that made a tent unnecessary. They called it siwash camping. The word comes from the Chinook jargon, the trading language that developed along the Pacific Northwest coast where Indigenous peoples, French-Canadian voyageurs, British traders, and American trappers needed a common tongue. Siwash meant, roughly, to travel as the native peoples traveled, swiftly, lightly, unencumbered by the heavy gear that slowed European-style expeditions. To siwash was to move through the wilderness, carrying only what you truly needed, trusting your knowledge to provide what your pack did not. W. Douglas Burden, documenting wilderness practices that were already fading when he wrote in the early 20th century, described siwash camping in his book, Look to the Wilderness. A man traveling siwash carried nothing but rifle, fry pan, tea pail, salt, tea, and a little sourdough. No tent, no cot, no bedroll as we would understand it, just the knowledge of how to find warmth in a frozen world and the skill to apply that knowledge before the cold claimed him. How was this possible? What did these men understand about surviving extreme cold that allowed them to sleep in temperatures that would kill an unprepared modern hiker in hours? The answer involves two techniques used in combination that together create what amounts to an outdoor heating system. The first is the long fire, a fire lay using entire tree-length logs that burned steadily through the night with minimal tending, producing a wall of radiant heat along the sleeper's entire length. The second is the bough bed, a thick mattress of evergreen branches that insulates the body from the frozen ground, preventing the earth from stealing heat faster than any fire could replace it. These weren't primitive substitutes for equipment that hadn't been invented yet. These were sophisticated techniques, refined over generations, that addressed the fundamental physics of heat loss in ways that modern campers rarely consider. The men who mastered these methods could sleep more warmly in the open air than a modern backpacker in a tent without a fire, and they knew it. This is knowledge we have almost entirely lost. Within 2 generations of synthetic sleeping bags and lightweight shelters, these techniques passed from daily practice to historical curiosity. The last practitioners were elderly men by the 1920s. Today, only scattered communities of bushcraft enthusiasts and traditional skills practitioners keep this knowledge alive. To understand how the siwash camp worked and why it worked so remarkably well, we need to first understand the world these men lived in. Not the romanticized frontier of legend, but the actual Rocky Mountain winter, the cold that shaped everything. The high country of the Rockies in the 1860s, the territories that would become Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, presented conditions that would empty a modern city within days. We complain when winter temperatures drop to single digits. We cancel school when the thermometer reads 0. The mountain frontier saw temperatures that made 0 feel like a warm spell. 20 below 0 was routine, 30 below. Sometimes 40 below 0 Fahrenheit. And these weren't brief cold snaps, remarkable lows that spiked one night and retreated by morning. These temperatures persisted for weeks at a time, settling into the mountain valleys like something physical, something with weight and presence. A man could watch the thermometer needle hover below -20 for days without relief, knowing that every moment outdoors was a negotiation with death. The mountain man trapper Zenas Leonard understood this cold intimately. In the winter of 1831 to 1832, his party found themselves on the Laramie Plains, the high, wind-swept grasslands of present-day Wyoming, when early October snows closed the passes behind them. They had planned to cross to lower country before winter truly set in. Instead, they were trapped. The snow came early and heavy, blocking their retreat, and they were forced to remain on the high plains until spring returned. Leonard's account, published years later as Narrative of the Adventures of Zenas Leonard, records that winter in spare, unsentimental prose that makes the suffering all the more vivid. This wasn't adventure, it was endurance. Week after week of cold that penetrated everything, that sapped strength and dulled the mind, that made every task of daily survival into an ordeal requiring focused will. This was the environment that frontier scouts and mountain men navigated as a matter of course. The Winter Rockies weren't an obstacle to be crossed once and escaped. They were home, workplace, and hunting ground combined. Survival in this country required not just tolerance of cold, but mastery of it. Consider what these men had to work with. Their kit was remarkably minimal by modern standards, not because they were poor or primitive, but because weight was survival. The foundation was wool. Wool blankets, specifically the 100% wool Hudson's Bay blankets that became standard equipment throughout the mountain trade. The distinctive colored stripes, point blankets they were called, with the number of stripes indicating size and weight, marked quality that could mean the difference between life and death. Unlike cotton, which loses all insulating capacity when wet, wool retains warmth even when damp. The Frontier Scouts' wool blanket wasn't a comfort item. It was survival gear of the highest order. More valuable still was the buffalo robe, the complete hide of a bison, thick and heavy, with the dense winter fur left intact. Nothing manufactured in that era came close to its insulating capacity. A good buffalo robe, fur side in, provided roughly the warmth of a modern synthetic sleeping bag rated for extreme cold, though it weighed 20 pounds or more and grew heavier still if it absorbed moisture. Trappers used buffalo robes as blankets, as heavy coats, as trade goods worth more than currency in the mountain economy. A man with a quality robe had one of the essential tools for winter survival. Clothing was buckskin and wool, layered according to conditions. Buckskin shed wind and resisted tearing. Wool provided insulation that worked even in dampness. Beneath the outer layers, cotton or linen undergarments, though experienced men learned that these became dangerous when sweated through, holding moisture against the skin. For fire starting, flint and steel. A small kit, A piece of high-carbon steel, a shard of flint or similar hard stone, and a charred cloth to catch the spark and nurse it into flame. No matches. These existed but were unreliable, easily ruined by moisture, a luxury rather than a necessity. A man who couldn't strike fire with flint and steel had no business in the mountain winter. A knife, certainly. Perhaps a small belt axe or hatchet, though many men traveled without one, preferring to save the weight. Their rifle, powder, and shot, both protection and the means of obtaining food. That was the kit. Everything a man needed to survive weeks in the wilderness, carried on his person or packed on a single horse. Notice what's missing. No synthetic insulation that maintains warmth when wet. No waterproof, breathable fabrics that shed rain and snow while allowing perspiration to escape. No sleeping pads with measured R values designed to prevent heat loss to the ground. No portable stoves. No lightweight tents made of ripstop nylon that weigh 3 pounds and deploy in minutes. Everything that modern backpackers consider essential equipment for cold weather camping simply did not exist. And yet these men didn't merely survive. They traveled, worked, hunted, and even thrived in conditions that would defeat most modern outdoorsmen equipped with thousands of dollars of technical gear. The stakes of failure were absolute. There were no second chances, no rescue helicopters, no calling for help. Captain Randolph Marcy understood this as well as any man alive. His book, The Prairie Traveler, published in 1859 as the official handbook of the War Department for overland expeditions, devoted significant attention to cold weather survival because Marcy had watched men die from inadequate preparation. In crossing the Rocky Mountains during the winter of 1857 to 1858, Marcy's expedition encountered conditions beyond what their equipment could handle. Their clothing wore through. Their shoes fell apart before reaching the summit. Many of them, Marcy recorded with the flat understatement of official report, had their feet badly frozen in consequence. Badly frozen feet on the frontier didn't mean a trip to the hospital, a course of treatment, a few weeks of recovery. It meant blackening flesh, the smell of gangrene, possible amputation performed with a hunting knife and a leather strap to bite down on. It meant possible death, far from help, surrounded by men who could do nothing but watch. The mountain man James Clyman left an account that shows how quickly the margin could vanish. Caught in a blizzard in Wyoming's Wind River Valley with William Sublette, Clyman and his companion had only their buffalo robes for shelter. They burrowed into the snow, wrapped in their robes, and tried to wait out the storm. Clyman wrote that the cold, hard, frozen earth on which they lay was still more disagreeable than the wind and snow above, so uncomfortable that sleep was out of the question. They lay there through the night, too cold to sleep, but unable to do anything about it. And then, as morning approached and they tried to strike fire, they discovered that their hands had grown too numb to work flint and steel. The fine motor control required to strike a spark, to nurse the spark into flame, to build flame into fire, this delicate work became impossible when fingers felt like wooden blocks at the ends of your wrists. They survived, but only by staying in constant motion through the rest of the night, generating body heat through sheer activity, until dawn brought enough warmth to restore feeling to their hands. The lesson was brutally clear. Technique mattered. Speed mattered. The ability to build fire and shelter before the cold claimed your dexterity could be the difference between life and death. Given these stakes, an obvious question arises. If tents existed, and they did, canvas tents were standard military equipment. Why didn't experienced frontiersmen carry them? The answer begins with weight. Scouts needed to move fast. A scout might be carrying messages between military outposts, separated by 100 miles of mountain terrain. He might be guiding a wagon train, ranging ahead to find water sources, assess routes, identify dangers before the slow-moving column encountered them. He might be hunting, following game across country that changed daily, covering ground that a burdened man simply couldn't match. Every pound of gear meant slower travel, more strain on horses, less distance covered before nightfall. A canvas tent added weight, not just the fabric itself, but poles, stakes, and rope, the additional bulk requiring a larger pack or an extra pack animal. For men whose survival often depended on speed, this weight could prove decisive. Reaching shelter before a storm, catching up with a wagon train before it moved beyond recovery, finding game before provisions ran out, these calculations drove the frontier obsession with traveling light. But there was another reason experienced men rejected tents, one that surprises most modern campers. These men had learned through cold experience, not theory, that proper fire technique combined with ground insulation could keep them warmer than a tent without fire. Think about what a tent actually provides. It blocks wind. It creates a sense of enclosure, of shelter, of separation from the wild darkness beyond its walls. These are real benefits, psychologically and physically. But a tent also has liabilities that become serious in extreme cold. A tent traps moisture. Every breath you exhale carries water vapor, and in a sealed tent, that moisture has nowhere to go. It collects on the tent walls, condensing into frost and ice that will later melt and drip onto your bedding. By morning, the inside of a tent occupied all night can be remarkably damp, and damp insulation is compromised insulation. A tent blocks radiant heat. A fire burning outside a tent provides no warmth to the occupant inside. The canvas walls that protect against wind also shield against the one significant heat source available in the winter wilderness. A man in a tent is alone with his body heat, hoping his blankets can hold enough warmth to see him through to morning. The siwash method reversed this equation entirely. Yes, the sleeper was exposed to the open sky, but he was also exposed to the direct radiant heat of a fire built specifically to burn all night. The moisture from his breath dissipated into the dry mountain air rather than collecting above him. The absence of overhead shelter wasn't a failure. It was a design feature. To understand why this worked, we need to understand how the human body loses heat. This isn't abstract physics. It's the fundamental reality that every frontier survival technique was designed to address. Get this wrong, and no amount of determination will save you. Your body generates heat constantly, even at rest. Roughly 80 to 100 watts of thermal energy produced by your metabolism 24 hours a day. In moderate conditions, a comfortable room at 70 degrees Fahrenheit, this is more than enough to maintain your core temperature. Your body radiates the excess into the environment. The environment absorbs it, and everything balances. In extreme cold, that balance collapses. The cold strips heat away faster than your body can produce it, and it does so through 4 distinct mechanisms. Understanding these 4 pathways is the key to understanding how frontier techniques defeated them. The first mechanism is conduction, the direct transfer of heat through physical contact. Lie on frozen ground, and your body heat flows directly into the earth beneath you. Heat always moves toward cold, and the frozen ground is cold beyond any warming. Here is the crucial point. The ground is effectively an infinite heat sink. It can absorb all the heat your body produces continuously, indefinitely, without ever warming up enough to slow the transfer. The Earth has thermal mass beyond calculation. Your 80 watts of heat production means nothing against it. Without insulation between body and ground, conductive heat loss alone can induce hypothermia, even with warm covering above. You could wrap yourself in the finest blankets ever made, and the frozen ground would still steal your life away through your back. The second mechanism is convection, the movement of air carrying heat away from your body. Your body constantly warms the layer of air immediately around it. In still conditions, this warm boundary layer provides some insulation. But wind, any movement of air, strips this layer away, replacing it with cold air that must be warmed again and again and again. Each gust carries away heat that your body must replace. This is wind chill. At 30 below zero, wind chill is not merely uncomfortable, it is lethal arithmetic. A 20-mile-per-hour wind transforms 30 below into something that attacks exposed flesh like 50 below zero. The numbers aren't metaphors. Wind accelerates heat loss by a factor that can mean the difference between discomfort and death. The third mechanism is radiation, your body heat radiating outward into space. Every warm object radiates heat toward cooler objects and cooler space. On a clear winter night with no clouds to return some of that energy, you are radiating heat upward toward a sky that offers nothing in return. Your warmth bleeds away into the void above continuously, regardless of wind, regardless of whether you're touching cold surfaces. The stars above you are pulling heat from your body simply by being cold. The fourth mechanism is evaporation, moisture carrying heat away as it transitions from liquid to vapor. Water absorbs enormous amounts of energy when it evaporates. Sweat on your skin, moisture in your breath, dampness in your clothing, all of it carries heat with it as it leaves. And water conducts heat away from the body 25 to 30 times faster than air. Wet clothing isn't just uncomfortable, it's potentially fatal. The perspiration that soaked your shirt during hard work becomes a heat-stealing layer the moment you stop moving. 4 enemies: conduction, convection, radiation, evaporation. Every cold weather survival technique, traditional or modern, addresses some combination of these 4. The frontier scout, who could sleep in 30 below temperatures, had to defeat all of them simultaneously. The siwash method did exactly that. The centerpiece of the siwash camp was the long fire. This was not a campfire as most people imagine it, not a contained heap of wood throwing flames and sparks upward into the darkness. The long fire was a fundamentally different construction, designed for a fundamentally different purpose. The technique went by various names across cultures that had learned to survive extreme cold. Americans called it the long fire or Indian fire, acknowledging its indigenous origins. Scandinavian traditions use the term rekovalka, the gap fire, the fire that burns between parallel logs. French-Canadian voyageurs, whose birch bark canoes had carried European trade goods and frontier knowledge through the northern forests for 2 centuries, had their own variations. Whatever the name, the principle remained consistent. A fire that burned steadily all night, producing radiant heat along the sleeper's entire length, requiring only occasional attention to maintain. Construction began with site selection, and here the scouts' knowledge of terrain came into play. The ideal site offered natural wind protection, the base of a hill, a dense stand of timber, a rock formation that would block prevailing winds. Within this protected area, the scout looked for 2 essential resources in close proximity: dead standing timber for fuel, live evergreens for bedding. Finding a site where both were abundant meant less work in failing light, less energy expended in gathering, more time for the construction itself. Dead standing trees, timber that had died on its feet but remained upright, provided the best fuel. These trees, perhaps killed by bark beetles or drought years before, had dried and seasoned while standing. Unlike fallen logs, which might be rotted, wet, or frozen into the ground, dead standing timber was dry, sound, and accessible. Lodgepole pine, abundant in the Rockies, served ideally. The scout identified suitable trees 6 to 8 inches in diameter, dead but not decayed, and felled them with his belt axe. 2 or 3 trees came down, trimmed of branches, the trunks cut or dragged to 6 or 8 foot lengths. Longer than a man is tall, as the old descriptions put it. The trimmed branches were set aside. They would become kindling. 2 of the prepared logs were laid parallel on the ground, approximately 6 to 8 inches apart. This gap between them was crucial. Shorter lengths of wood, support logs, were placed beneath the ends, elevating the main logs slightly to allow airflow beneath the fire. Fire needs air. Cutting off that air means killing the fire. Into the gap between the parallel logs went the kindling, the trimmed branches, broken into lengths appropriate to the space, pencil-thick sticks and thumb-thick pieces filling the channel between the logs. Beneath this kindling, finer material, pine needles gathered from the ground, thin curls of bark shaved with a knife, anything that would catch a spark and carry it upward into flame. The tinder was arranged deliberately, finest material at the bottom, coarser above, creating a ladder of combustion. With flint struck against steel and a piece of charred cloth positioned to catch the spark, the scout coaxed fire into being. A skilled man could strike sparks consistently, directing them onto the charred cloth where they caught and smoldered. The cloth was transferred to the tinder, blown upon gently, nursed until smoke became flame. In 5 minutes, if technique was sound, the kindling had caught. In 15, the main logs began to glow along their inner faces, the faces that looked across the gap at each other. This was the genius of the design. The fire burned in the gap, but it heated the logs themselves. As the inner faces caught and began to char, they radiated heat outward, not upward like a conventional fire, but sideways. And not from a single point, but along the entire 6 to 8 foot length of the logs. A third log, placed atop the burning pair, continued the fire as lower logs were consumed. Throughout the night, the fire would burn steadily, requiring only occasional maintenance, pushing logs inward as their inner faces burned away, adding a fresh log atop as earlier ones collapsed. 8 hours of steady heat from a single construction, with only brief interruptions for adjustment. The result was not a campfire. It was a wall of heat, a radiant barrier that warmed a sleeping man along his entire length, from head to foot, through the long mountain night. But the fire addressed only half the problem. The most sophisticated fire means nothing if the ground below is stealing heat faster than flames can replace it. And the frozen ground of a Rocky Mountain winter was an enemy every bit as dangerous as the cold air above. This was where the second element of siwash camping became essential, the bough bed. The technique appears simple: pile evergreen branches on the ground and sleep atop them. But execution demanded understanding of both materials and method. Done poorly, a bough bed was barely better than bare ground. Done properly, it provided insulation that matched or exceeded modern sleeping pads. While the fire established itself, the scout turned to gathering boughs. Balsam fir was preferred wherever it grew. Its flat needle arrangement created a dense, springy surface, and its pleasant fragrance made the bed more welcoming. Where fir was unavailable, spruce or pine served. Any evergreen would provide some insulation. The key was quantity. Daniel Carter Beard, founder of the Boy Scouts, described the technique in his 1914 manual, Shelters, Shacks, and Shanties, 1 handful at a time. Grasp the bough with your thumb on top. Snap it with a twist of the wrist. The green branches break cleanly when pulled against their direction of growth. It sounds easy enough in description. In practice, with light fading and cold settling in, the work required sustained effort. Voyageurs developed methods for efficient gathering. Stringing boughs on a carrying stick allowed a man to transport armloads of material in a single trip. 4 trips, perhaps 5, bringing in quantities that would seem excessive to anyone who hadn't spent a night on frozen ground. 50 pounds of boughs, maybe 100. This wasn't a decorative gesture, it was construction. The bed went down in layers, larger boughs first, laid as foundation, their thick stems pointing downward, overlapping from head to foot like shingles on a roof. Beard's instructions were precise. Commence at the head and shingle them down to the foot so that the tips point toward the head of the bed, overlapping the butts. Layer upon layer, building the mattress until it rose 6 to 12 inches above the frozen earth. When the scout's weight compressed this mass, when he finally lay down to rest, it would settle to perhaps 4 to 6 inches of insulation, but 4 to 6 inches of trapped air, held in place by countless needles and branches, separating the human body from the earth that would otherwise drain its warmth all night. The bough bed worked on exactly the same principle as modern insulation: dead airspace. Air is a poor conductor of heat, which means it makes an excellent insulator as long as it isn't moving. The countless tiny pockets between needles, the larger gaps between branches, the springy structure that prevented compression to nothing, all of this trapped still air between body and ground. The boughs didn't provide warmth. The scout's body provided the warmth. What the boughs did was prevent the frozen earth from stealing it away. Modern testing of traditional bough bed construction suggests insulation values equivalent to R4 or R5 on contemporary scales. For comparison, a standard closed-cell foam sleeping pad might rate R2 to R3. The frontier method, executed properly, outperformed equipment that wouldn't be invented for another century. With fire built and bed constructed, the final element was position. The scout lay parallel to the long fire, approximately 1 step away, about 3 feet. His feet pointed toward the fire's center, where heat was most intense. The fire warmed his front along his entire length. His buffalo robe or wool blankets wrapped around him, fur or wool side inward, protecting his back while trapping body heat within. The bough bed beneath him prevented ground conduction. 3 of the 4 enemies were now addressed: radiation countered by the fire, conduction blocked by the boughs, evaporation managed by staying dry during the day's work. Only convection remained, the wind that could strip away all the warmth the fire provided. Many frontiersmen enhanced heat capture by constructing a simple reflector wall behind their sleeping position. Stacked logs, banked snow, a natural feature like a rock face or steep embankment, anything that would bounce the fire's radiant heat back toward the sleeper. Instead of warmth radiating uselessly into empty space, it returned, creating a pocket of heated air with the sleeper at its center. Some scouts selected their sites specifically for natural reflectors, positioning against a large fallen log, the face of a low cliff, a boulder that would serve the purpose without additional construction. Site selection and fire technique merged into a single integrated skill. The system was complete: fire providing radiant heat, bough bed preventing conductive loss, reflector capturing energy that would otherwise escape, buffalo robe or blankets blocking wind and trapping body warmth. 4 mechanisms of heat loss, each addressed by deliberate technique. Not by accident, not by luck, but by accumulated wisdom refined across generations of mountain survival. The scout did not sleep as modern people understand sleep, 8 uninterrupted hours of unconsciousness. He dozed, woke to push the logs together or add wood, dozed again. 2 wakings through the night, perhaps 3 or 4. This was expected, not failure. The goal was not perfect rest, but functional rest, enough recovery to rise at dawn and travel another day. The long fire, properly built, made this possible. Unlike a conventional campfire that demanded constant feeding, the long fire burned steadily with only occasional adjustment. The scout could rest for 2 hours, 3 hours, before the cooling of his front told him it was time to tend the flames. A few minutes of work, pushing logs inward, perhaps adding a fresh log atop, and he returned to his bough bed, wrapped again in his robe, warm again until the next adjustment. As one modern practitioner of traditional skills has observed, sunrise is when you get your nap in. Through the dark hours, your focus is getting to said sunrise, but understanding the method is only part of the picture. Building a long fire in a bough bed was something that could be described, even demonstrated. What separated the man who merely survived from the man who woke, rested and ready to travel, was something harder to convey: the accumulated knowledge that came only from practice, from nights spent in the cold, from learning what worked not from a book, but from your own freezing body. The real question is what it took to do this well. The difference between adequate technique and excellent technique often came down to details that couldn't be taught in words, things a man had to learn through his own cold nights, his own mistakes, his own gradual refinement. Consider fire placement. One step from the fire, approximately 3 feet, that was the general guidance. But the right distance varied with conditions. A larger fire threw more heat. You could sleep farther away. A smaller fire, built when fuel was scarce, required closer positioning. Wind direction mattered. The angle of the reflector mattered. A man learned to read these variables, not through calculation, but through feel, through the accumulated memory of nights spent adjusting and readjusting until the balance was right. Position too close, and you woke with your face burning while your back froze. Too far, and the fire's warmth barely reached you. The experienced scout found the distance where warmth enveloped him evenly, where he could sleep deeply enough to rest without sleeping so deeply he failed to notice when the fire burned low. The quality of the bough bed revealed skill as clearly as any other element. A novice gathered boughs hastily, threw them on the ground in a heap, and spent the night feeling every frozen lump beneath him as the thin layer compressed to nothing. An experienced man selected his boughs deliberately, the right size, the right flexibility, and laid them with the patience of a craftsman, building a mattress that would maintain its loft through the night. He knew that the hours spent on proper bed construction would be repaid many times over in the quality of his rest. Firewood selection separated the competent from the expert. Not all dead-standing timber burned equally. Wood that had stood too long might be punky, rotted from within, producing more smoke than heat. Wood from certain species burned too fast, requiring constant attention. The ideal was dense, well-seasoned timber that would catch readily but burn slowly, and a man learned to identify this by the sound of his axe striking bark, by the weight of the wood, by the color and texture of the grain. The buffalo robe required its own expertise. Wrapping yourself in a heavy hide sounds simple enough. But the robe had to be positioned so that no gaps allowed cold air to penetrate, so that body heat was trapped efficiently, so that the weight didn't constrict breathing or circulation. Veterans developed personal techniques, particular ways of tucking and folding, specific positions that worked for their bodies, and these details, seemingly trivial, accumulated into the difference between a night of genuine rest and a night of shivering endurance. Perhaps most importantly, the experienced scout understood energy management in ways that aren't immediately obvious. He knew not to work himself into a sweat while gathering wood and building camp. Sweat-soaked clothing became a deadly liability the moment active work stopped. He paced his efforts, opened his coat when he felt warmth building, stayed dry through the transition from labor to rest. He knew to eat before sleeping. The body needs fuel to generate heat through a long, cold night, but not so heavily that digestion disrupted sleep. These were not techniques that could be fully conveyed in instruction. They were the residue of experience, the wisdom that accumulated through seasons of practice. A man might understand the theory of siwash camping after a single explanation. Mastering the practice took years. The underlying wisdom of this method went deeper than practical technique. The men who developed and refined these approaches understood principles that wouldn't be formally articulated for generations, principles that modern thermal engineering has confirmed but did not discover. The bough bed worked on what might be called the dead air principle. Trapped air that cannot circulate becomes an excellent insulator because air is a poor conductor of heat and convection requires movement. The countless small pockets between evergreen needles, the larger spaces between branches, the springy structure that resisted complete compression, all of this created dead airspace that blocked conductive heat loss. The frontier scout knew this worked without knowing the physics that explained it. The long fire embodied what we might call the thermal mass principle. The large logs didn't just burn, they absorbed heat, became heat reservoirs that continued radiating warmth even as the flames fluctuated. This is why the long fire maintained steadier temperatures than a conventional campfire of the same fuel consumption. The logs themselves became part of the heating system, smoothing out the spikes and valleys of an ordinary fire. The reflector exploited the principle of radiant heat capture. Heat radiates in straight lines, like light. A reflective surface behind the sleeper bounced that radiation back, effectively doubling the fire's efficiency in warming the occupied space. The scout might not have described it in terms of angles of incidence and reflection, but he understood that a wall at his back made the fire's warmth go further. Most sophisticated of all was the system's integration, the way fire, bed, reflector, and covering worked together to address every mechanism of heat loss simultaneously. This wasn't a single technique, but an interlocking system, each element dependent on the others. Remove any one component, and the whole became far less effective. The genius lay not in any individual element, but in their combination. This knowledge didn't emerge from any single mind. It accumulated across generations, refined through countless cold nights by thousands of men who made incremental improvements and passed them on. Indigenous peoples of the northern forests had developed the core techniques over millennia. French-Canadian voyageurs, traveling the fur trade routes for 2 centuries, had adapted and elaborated these methods. Mountain men learned from indigenous guides, from voyager companions, from each other. Each generation received the knowledge, tested it against their own experience, added what they learned, and passed it forward. By the 1860s, when Army scouts and frontier guides used these techniques routinely, they were drawing on a deep reservoir of accumulated wisdom. They were the inheritors of knowledge that had been tested, refined, and proven across more winters than any individual could experience in a lifetime. To truly understand what this meant, what it felt like to practice these skills not as historical recreation but as daily necessity, we need to step into a single night. Not the abstraction of technique, but the lived reality of one man, one evening, one frozen darkness in the Rocky Mountain winter. Imagine late afternoon in the high country. December, perhaps. The scout has traveled 20 miles since dawn, following a frozen creek drainage through mountain terrain that offers no straight path. His horse picks its way through snow that varies from ankle-deep to thigh-deep, finding the route by instinct as much as guidance. The scout's breath has frozen on his wool muffler. Ice crystals crust his eyebrows. His fingers, even in heavy mittens, have grown stiff on the reins. The sun drops behind the western peaks around 4 o'clock in these short December days. Within minutes of its disappearance, the temperature begins falling, 5 degrees, 10 degrees, plummeting toward the deep cold that owns the mountain night. The scout knows he has perhaps an hour of useful light remaining, less if clouds move in. He reads the terrain as he travels, evaluating potential campsites the way a modern traveler might scan for motels. This depression, at the base of a timbered ridge, protected from the northwest wind by rising ground, dense with the gray trunks of dead standing lodgepole pine, a thick grove of subalpine fir within 100 yards. This is the place. He dismounts, ties his horse where it can paw through snow to reach dried grass beneath, and begins work without pause. There is no time for rest, no margin for delay. The light is failing, the cold is coming. Everything depends on the next hour. The axe comes first. He selects 3 dead-standing pines, each perhaps 8 inches at the base, their bark loose and gray, their wood dry and sound. The axe bites into the first trunk with a sound that carries across the silent valley, chunk, 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 the rhythm of survival. The tree falls. He limbs it quickly, the branches piling beside him, then moves to the second tree, the third. His breath comes hard. He feels warmth building beneath his wool coat. He opens the coat, continues working. Sweat is the enemy. The trimmed trunks he drags to his chosen site, a flat spot against the rise of the ridge, natural wind protection at his back. Two logs parallel, 6 inches apart, elevated on shorter pieces. The branches go into the gap as kindling, arranged from fine to coarse. Pine needles from the ground beneath a sheltering tree, dry, untouched by snow, form the tinder base. He strikes flint to steel. Sparks shower onto the charred cloth held ready. One spark catches, glows red, spreads. He lifts the cloth to the tinder, blows gently, steadily, watching smoke thicken into the first tentative flames. The flames catch the finest needles, climb to twigs, reach upward toward the kindling. In 5 minutes, fire crackles in the gap between the logs. In 15, the logs themselves begin to glow along their inner faces. The fire established, he turns to the fir grove. Light is nearly gone now. The sky above still holds pale color, but beneath the trees, darkness gathers. He works by feel as much as sight, grasping boughs, snapping them with the practiced twist, threading them onto a carrying stick that lets him haul armloads at once. 4 trips, 5, his shoulders ache. His hands, bare for the close work of gathering, have grown numb. He pauses to warm them at the fire, now burning steadily, casting flickering orange light against the snow, then returns for another load. The bed rises in layers. Large boughs first, stems down, overlapping head to foot. Smaller tips atop, building thickness. When he finally judges it sufficient, the mattress stands 8 inches deep, a dark green rectangle in the firelight, waiting to receive his weight. Full darkness now. The temperature has dropped below 0 and continues falling. He cannot know the precise number without instruments, but he feels the burn in his nostrils with each breath, the ache in his cheekbones, the way the cold presses against every exposed inch of skin. 20 below, perhaps. 30. The stars emerge with the fierce clarity that only extreme cold produces, countless points of light across a sky unmarked by cloud. He tends to his horse, loosening the saddle, checking hooves, ensuring the animal has access to forage and the snow it will eat for water. The horse is adapted to this cold in ways humans are not. Its thick winter coat and lower metabolic needs making survival simpler. But a horseman tends his horse before himself. This is not sentiment. It is necessity. Without the horse, the scout walks. At last, he turns to his own rest. He positions himself on the bough bed, 1 step from the fire, parallel to its length. The buffalo robe comes around him, heavy, awkward, familiar. Fur side in, the dense pile trapping air against his body. He tucks and folds, working by firelight and touch, sealing the gaps where cold might enter. He lies still. The fire's warmth reaches his face, his chest, penetrates through layers of wool to his core. His back, pressed into the bough bed, feels the springy resistance of countless needles. Above him, stars wheel slowly across the black sky, Orion rising in the east, the Dipper circling the pole star. He does not sleep, not at first. He rests. His body, exhausted from the day's travel, sinks into the bed. His eyes close, open, close again. His mind drifts in the half-aware state between waking and sleep that serves as rest for men who cannot afford true unconsciousness. Some hours later, 2, perhaps 3. He does not measure. He wakes to cold on his face. The fire has burned down, the logs settling into coals. He rises, stiff, moves to the fire, pushes the logs together with a stick, adds the 3rd log atop the renewed flames. The wood catches quickly, the fire rebuilds. He returns to his bed, rearranges his robe, and drifts again into rest. Twice more through the night, this cycle repeats. Cold waking him, fire tending, return to the bough bed. Each time he rises, the stars have moved in their slow arc. Each time he returns, the warmth returning to his face, his hands, his chest. Somewhere in the small hours, between one fire tending and the next, he sleeps genuinely, deeply enough that dreams flicker through his exhausted mind. Not long, perhaps an hour, but rest, real rest, that allows the body to repair and restore. Dawn comes slowly in winter. The sky lightens in the east, gray pressing back the black, while the western peaks remain in shadow. The scout rises before the sun clears the horizon. His fire has burned to coals again, but coals still hold heat. He adds wood, builds the flames, sets his small pot to heat water. Coffee, if he has it. If not, hot water with a handful of wild mint gathered and dried months ago. Something warm in the belly before the day's travel begins. He eats dried meat, hard bread, whatever provisions ride in his saddlebags, chewing methodically, refueling the body that will need every calorie in the cold hours ahead. By the time sun strikes the eastern ridge, he is mounted and moving. Behind him, the fire dies in its ring of trampled snow. The bough bed, compressed by his weight, slowly releases, needles catching crystals of frost. By afternoon, fresh snow may cover all signs of his passage. The forest returns to silence. This was not adventure. This was not recreation. This was simply how a man slept when his work required travel through the winter mountains, night after night, week after week, for as long as the work demanded. The siwash camp technique did not exist in isolation. It was one thread in a comprehensive fabric of survival knowledge that frontier scouts and mountain men had to master to remain alive. A man who could build a proper long fire and bough bed had also, necessarily, learned a dozen related skills. Axe work, not just chopping, but the efficient, accurate axe work that fells trees safely and quickly, that produces usable pieces without wasted motion or energy. Fire starting, not just in favorable conditions, but with numb hands, in wind, with damp materials, under pressure of failing light and falling temperature. Material identification, knowing which trees provided dense, slow-burning fuel and which burned too fast for overnight fires, which evergreens made the best bedding, and which compressed too readily. Beyond the immediate techniques lay broader knowledge, reading terrain for shelter potential, for water sources, for danger. Reading weather from clouds, wind, and the behavior of animals. Reading animal sign for tracking, for hunting, for awareness of predators. Navigation without maps or trails, orienting by sun, stars, and the subtle variations of the landscape itself. The man who could sleep in 30 below temperatures without a tent could also find water in arid country, could treat his own injuries with the materials at hand, could make moccasins when boots wore through, could butcher an elk and preserve the meat for weeks of travel. These skills were not separate accomplishments, but facets of a single integrated competence, the ability to live within the wilderness rather than merely passing through it. This web of knowledge developed because it had to. The frontier offered no specialists, no emergency services, no backup systems. A man far from settlement had to be his own doctor, his own repairman, his own provisioner. The failure of any single skill could cascade into catastrophe. Consider what a single night's siwash camp required beyond the obvious fire and bed construction. Site selection demanded understanding of wind patterns, terrain features, and resource availability. Axe work demanded strength, technique, and stamina. Fire starting demanded fine motor control and practiced judgment. Material gathering demanded knowledge of local flora and the ability to work efficiently in fading light. Throughout, energy management demanded awareness of the body's needs, staying dry, avoiding exhaustion, maintaining enough fuel to generate heat through a cold night. Each skill supported the others. A man who couldn't start fire reliably wouldn't survive to develop his shelter-building technique. A man who built poor fires would never master the judgment of positioning that made the long fire method truly effective. Competence accumulated layer upon layer, each ability enabling the development of the next. Community reinforced this learning. No frontiersman acquired all his knowledge alone. Mountain men traveled in brigades during the trapping season, sharing camps and exchanging techniques. At the annual rendezvous, the great summer gatherings where trappers sold their furs and resupplied, hundreds of men came together, and their mountain yarns, the stories traded around evening fires, encoded practical knowledge within entertainment. Osborne Russell, whose Journal of a Trapper documented life in the Rocky Mountain fur trade from 1834 to 1843, recorded these gatherings and the knowledge that flowed through them. Men who had discovered new techniques, found better materials, or developed improved methods shared their innovations through stories that other men would remember and apply. The voyageur tradition contributed its own deep reservoir of cold weather expertise. French-Canadian voyageurs had been traveling the northern waterways for nearly 2 centuries before the American fur trade reached the Rockies. They brought techniques refined through generations of winter travel, techniques originally learned from indigenous peoples of the northern forests and adapted through their own extensive experience. American mountain men learned from voyageur companions, absorbing knowledge that had been developing since before the United States existed. Indigenous peoples themselves remained the ultimate source of much frontier survival knowledge. The Cree, the Blackfeet, the Shoshone, the peoples who had lived in these mountains for thousands of years, their techniques for surviving extreme cold were the foundation upon which all later methods built. The very term siwash acknowledged this origin. When frontiersmen traveled siwash, they were consciously adopting methods that indigenous peoples had perfected across generations beyond counting. This was not a single skill, but a civilization's worth of environmental adaptation compressed into the knowledge that one man could carry in his head and apply with his hands. The siwash method worked across the Mountain West, but it was not uniform. Different environments demanded different adaptations, and the techniques evolved to match local conditions. In the northern Rockies, the high country of present-day Montana and Wyoming, lodgepole pine dominated the forests, providing excellent long-fire fuel. Subalpine fir offered ideal bedding material at higher elevations. Deep snow, while making travel difficult, provided an additional resource: snow walls for wind protection, snow trenches for emergency shelter. Here, the technique reached its fullest development, pushed to its limits by cold that regularly exceeded 30 below. The southern Rockies presented different conditions. In present-day Colorado and New Mexico, Engelmann spruce and Douglas fir replaced the northern species. Piñon pine at lower elevations burned hot but fast, requiring different fire management. The cold was less extreme but more variable. A night might begin mild and turn savage as weather moved through. Scouts adapted their methods accordingly. The Great Plains posed the greatest challenge. Timber was scarce, sometimes entirely absent for miles of travel. Cottonwood grew along river corridors, providing both fuel and shelter sites, but away from water, the plains offered nothing but grass and sky. Buffalo chips, dried bison dung, served as emergency fuel, burning with surprising heat, though requiring large quantities. Without trees for reflectors or boughs for beds, scouts relied more heavily on buffalo robes, sometimes scraping depressions in the ground and burying themselves in snow for insulation. The siwash method adapted, but its limits were tested in country that provided so little material to work with. Circumstances forced further variations. Traveling in pairs or small groups, men could build longer fires to accommodate multiple sleepers. Some accounts describe building 2 parallel fires with sleepers between them, though this doubled the fuel requirement and was practical only where timber was abundant. Emergency situations called for emergency measures. Hollow logs as shelter, burrows dug into deep snow, the sit-out of simply staying awake and active through an entire night when conditions made any form of sleep impossible. For extended camps where a man might remain several nights in one location, more elaborate arrangements made sense. Pole-frame shelters covered with boughs, the half-faced camp described in period manuals, provided more protection than the open siwash arrangement. Reflector walls of stacked logs could be built to permanent standards. Fire trenches dug into the ground concentrated heat. Platform beds raised sleeping surfaces above snow level. These semi-permanent camps bridged the gap between pure siwash travel and the more substantial structures used in base camps. The technique evolved over time as available equipment changed. By the 1860s, the pure mountain man era was fading. Army Scouts had access to military blankets, canvas tarps, and manufactured goods that earlier trappers could only dream of. The pure siwash method, fire, boughs, and buffalo robe alone, became less necessary as transportation improved and supply lines extended into previously remote territories. But the knowledge persisted among those who valued mobility above comfort. As late as the early 20th century, northern trappers and wilderness travelers employed variants of the long fire and bough bed. The techniques that had kept mountain men alive in the 1830s continued to prove their worth for nearly 100 years, until the fundamental transformation of outdoor equipment finally made them obsolete. The knowledge faded not because it stopped working, but because it stopped being necessary. The transformation came in stages. In the 1860s and 1870s, railroads penetrated the West. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, compressed journeys that once took months into days. Behind the railroads came settlement, towns, supply lines. The vast, empty spaces that had demanded complete self-reliance began to shrink. By the 1880s and 1890s, the frontier itself was closing. The 1890 census famously declared that a continuous line of settlement now stretched from coast to coast. The frontier, as a distinct region, had ceased to exist. The conditions that had required siwash camping were becoming historical, not present. The early 20th century brought modern camping culture, but camping as recreation, not survival. Manufactured tents, sleeping bags, and camping equipment became commercially available. The outdoor industry emerged, producing gear designed for people who chose to spend time in wilderness, not people who lived and worked there year-round. This was genuine progress. Modern equipment is more reliable, more comfortable, less demanding of skill. A contemporary backpacker with a synthetic sleeping bag rated to 20 below, an insulated sleeping pad, and a lightweight tent can sleep more comfortably in extreme cold than all but the most skilled frontier scouts. The trade-off seemed obvious: carry 3 or 4 pounds of gear and eliminate the need for an hour of skilled labor every evening. What was less obvious was what disappeared along with the old techniques. Knowledge, once lost, does not return on its own. The generation of men who practiced siwash camping routinely aged, retired, died. Their children might have heard stories, might have learned a few techniques, but never needed to use them with the regularity that builds true competence. Their grandchildren knew the methods existed, perhaps had read about them, but possessed no direct connection to the practice. Generation 1. Practitioners who use the technique daily, for whom it is simply how one travels in winter. Generation 2. Children who learn from practitioners but use the knowledge occasionally, for whom it becomes one option among several. Generation 3. Adults who heard about it from grandfather, who remember the stories, who might attempt the technique once or twice as recreation, but never develop mastery. Generation 4. People for whom the technique has passed into history, a curiosity to read about, something that seems remarkable because the lived context has vanished. From 1860 to 1920, 2 generations, this transition was largely complete. By the time W. Douglas Burden documented siwash camping in his writings, he was recording the memories of old men, preserving knowledge that was already passing from living practice into historical record. What disappeared was not merely a technique for sleeping without a tent. It was a relationship with the environment, a capacity for self-reliance, a confidence in one's own ability to meet the challenges of the natural world without manufactured assistance. The frontier scout who could sleep in 30 below temperatures with nothing but fire, boughs, and a buffalo robe possessed a fundamental security that most modern people have never experienced. He knew he could survive with minimal equipment because he had done it countless times. The wilderness was not alien territory to be feared, but home ground to be lived within. Modern outdoor culture has, appropriately, developed much lower tolerance for environmental risk. We carry backup systems, communication devices, navigation tools, emergency shelters. This is wise. We no longer have the daily practice that made frontier skills reliable. But the trade-off is real. We have gained comfort and safety margin. We have lost a kind of capability that our ancestors took for granted. This is not nostalgia for an idealized past. Frontier life was brutal, often short, and frequently miserable. Men froze to death despite their skills. The techniques failed sometimes, or the conditions exceeded them, or mistakes proved fatal. No reasonable person would choose to return to an era when a broken leg in the wilderness meant almost certain death. But the exchange of skill for equipment represents a genuine trade-off. Something of value was lost in the gaining of something else of value. To recognize this is not to reject progress, but to understand what progress cost. The techniques are not entirely extinct. Small communities continue to practice and preserve the knowledge. Modern bushcraft enthusiasts study historical wilderness skills, including the long fire and bough bed. Paul Kirtley, a UK-based wilderness instructor, has documented Scandinavian variations of the technique that parallel the American frontier methods. These practitioners approach the skills as a discipline, training and refining their abilities, keeping alive knowledge that would otherwise exist only in books. Some indigenous communities in Arctic and subarctic regions maintain traditional cold weather survival practices that descend from the same roots. The Cree, the Inuit, and other northern peoples preserved knowledge that European-descended frontier cultures learned and later forgot. In some communities, traditional skills remain part of living culture rather than historical recreation. Military survival training continues to include improvised shelter and fire techniques, though in attenuated form compared to frontier practice. Special operations forces learn methods that echo what mountain men knew, adapted to modern tactical contexts. The knowledge remains relevant for those whose work takes them beyond the reach of manufactured support systems. Historical reenactors gather at mountain man rendezvous events, practicing period-appropriate skills in a social context that mirrors the original knowledge-sharing function of those annual gatherings. The depth of expertise varies widely, but the events maintain cultural memory of what frontier life required. These communities together form a thin thread of continuity connecting past knowledge to the present. The skills can still be learned. The techniques still work. The wisdom has not been entirely lost, but what the siwash camp technique reveals goes beyond practical methodology. It illuminates something fundamental about human capability and about what we choose to remember. The frontier scout who could sleep in 30 below temperatures without a tent was not superhuman. He was not made of different substance than modern people. He was a human being who had developed specific knowledge and practiced it until it became reliable. The techniques worked because they addressed the actual physics of cold weather survival, preventing conductive heat loss from the ground, providing radiant heat from the fire, blocking convective loss with covering. These principles haven't changed. The physics of heat transfer operates identically today. What changed was a cultural decision. Confronted with the challenges of cold weather outdoor living, our society chose to address those challenges with manufactured equipment rather than developed skill. This was reasonable. This was, by most measures, progress. But it was also a choice with consequences. Your great-great-grandmother knew how to preserve food without refrigeration because she had to. Canning, salting, smoking, drying, root cellar storage, these were not hobbies, but necessities. Within 2 generations of reliable refrigeration, that knowledge became rare, then remarkable, then the province of dedicated hobbyists and homesteaders. Your great-great-grandfather, if he lived and worked in the Mountain West, may have known how to sleep through a Rocky Mountain winter night with nothing but fire and pine branches, because his survival depended on it. Within 2 generations of synthetic sleeping bags and lightweight tents, that knowledge followed the same path, from daily practice to occasional use to fading memory to historical curiosity. The timeline of loss is faster than most people expect. Knowledge accumulated across centuries can vanish within decades when the conditions that required it change. This documentary cannot teach you to siwash camp. Watching a video is not the same as spending years practicing, as experiencing the cold yourself, as developing the judgment that comes only through repetition. No written or filmed instruction can substitute for the accumulated wisdom of hands-on experience. But perhaps something can be transmitted even without practice. An appreciation for what ordinary people accomplished, an understanding of how different life once was, a recognition that self-reliance was not a theory, but a daily reality for those who came before us. Imagine standing at the edge of a frozen mountain valley as darkness falls. The temperature drops past 0, past 10 below, heading toward depths of cold that most modern people have never experienced. The wind rises, snow begins to fall. With modern equipment, the answer is straightforward. Deploy your tent, crawl into your sleeping bag, activate your hand warmers, wait for morning. With frontier knowledge, the answer is different. Select your site, fell your logs, build your bed, light your fire. Lie down in the open air, watching stars wheel overhead between periods of rest, keeping one eye open, rising with the sun, ready to travel. Both approaches work. One requires equipment, the other requires knowledge. We have chosen, as a society, to rely on equipment. This is not wrong. Equipment is more reliable for untrained users, more forgiving of mistakes, more consistent across varying levels of skill. Progress in outdoor equipment has saved countless lives that would have been lost in earlier eras. But the capacity remains latent within us. The same bodies that wrap themselves in synthetic insulation could, with training and practice, survive as frontier scouts survived. The knowledge exists, preserved by those who have chosen to maintain it. The techniques work as well today as they did in 1860. The question is not which approach is better. That depends entirely on context, on the person, on the situation. The question is what we have chosen to remember and what we have allowed ourselves to forget. On winter nights in the high Rockies, the temperature still drops to 30 below. The stars still burn with that fierce clarity that only extreme cold produces. The frozen ground still waits to steal the warmth from any body that lies upon it unprotected. The mountains have not changed. Only we have changed in what we carry, in what we know, in what we believe ourselves capable of. Somewhere in those frozen valleys, if you could travel backward through time, you might find a man wrapped in a buffalo robe, lying on a bed of fir boughs, watching the flames of his long fire while stars wheeled overhead. He is not suffering. He is not in crisis. He is simply resting, as he has rested 100 nights before, confident in skills that have never failed him. He would not think of himself as remarkable. This is simply how a man sleeps when his work requires travel through the winter mountains. The fire, the bed, the robe, the rhythm of waking and tending and returning to rest, these are as natural to him as modern travelers find their tents and sleeping bags. But from where we stand, looking back across a century and a half of accumulated change, He seems remarkable indeed. A human being, equipped with nothing but knowledge and skill, sleeping through conditions that would defeat most of us, equipped with thousands of dollars of modern gear. He represents something we have lost. Not a simpler time. His time was anything but simple. Not a better time. His time was harder than ours in almost every way that matters. But a different relationship with the world. A different set of capabilities. A different answer to the question of what humans can do when they must. That answer still exists. It waits in the pages of old books, in the practices of traditional communities, in the experiments of modern enthusiasts who choose to learn what their ancestors knew. The fire still burns for those who know how to build it. The bed still insulates for those who take the time to construct it properly. The method still works, as well as it ever did, as well as physics and human physiology will always allow. What remains to be seen is whether we will remember.